I mean, I'm going to push back on one thing you said. I think he's an evil guy. I think he's damaged. And obviously
Yeah.
part of the.
You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in.
And welcome to Deep Dive Movie Reviews with my friend Steve Hackman and myself, James Marsh. This is our 100th episode, so we thought we'd talk Citizen Kane.
Hey, you know the drill. Before we talk Citizen Kane, if you haven't already subscribed to Deep Dive Movie Reviews, it'd be a great favor to us if you went ahead and did that. Hit the subscribe button while you're there. Just tap that little bell next to it. That way you're notified every single time we drop a new video. And just as a reminder, what am I saying this for Citizen Kane? If you haven't watched Citizen Kane yet,
it's the sledge. It's the sledge.
Yes, that's right. It's James. Let's talk Citizen Kane.
Yep. Okay, so first of all,
I gave it away right after.
I know. Well, this is a spoiler show, so it is arguably the greatest spoiler of all time, isn't it?
So much so that obviously, in news to our audience, I had not seen Citizen Kane. One of the reasons we chose to do this as the 100th, there's a couple reasons which we'll allude to or explain in a moment, but I had never seen it. But even I knew Rosebud was the sled.
Right.
There was no surprise. There was no surprises.
The only surprise was me discovering that you hadn't seen Citizen Kane, but we'll get into that in a minute. I mean, we do want to acknowledge this is our 100th episode, which is pretty crazy, really. I mean, we started doing this just over a year ago, and I don't know. I had no idea that we would get this far, or that we would have as many people watching and commenting and liking and subscribing and all the rest of it. So we just thought we wanted to say thank you to everybody who has watched the video, who has left a snarky comment, who has liked and subscribed. You are all very, very welcome. Please continue to do so. And we thought for the 100th episode, we would do something a little bit different. So what better than have a look at what is arguably, and I think there's going to be an argument, the greatest movie of all time.
It's not.
And horror of horrors. Yes, I discovered that you had not seen it.
No, I'm embarrassed to say, but it's just one of those things where I was thinking some of the classic movies that I would often watch with my parents, like on Turner Classic Movies, or would be on a Saturday afternoons when I was a kid growing up. And I watched a lot of classic black and white films back in the day. For some reason, Citizen Kane just was not on the regular cycle of rotation. It's not like, Citizen Kane's going to be on Saturday night. I don't remember it ever being on TV. And I think that led to probably me not seeing it all these years.
Well, and this is something I want to get out of the way quickly. It's not your regular crowd pleaser, really.
Mm-mm.
I mean, it wasn't a big blockbuster hit at the time for reasons that we'll get into. But also it's not. I remember you sort of saying to me when we were sort of first discussing this, you were like, well, it's not Casablanca, and I know that Casablanca is one of your favorite films, and you're right, absolutely right. It's not. I mean, Casablanca is one of the sort of the best, the greatest, gold standard of crowd pleaser Hollywood classics, and in many ways, Citizen Kane was a kind of disruptor of that model and of that formula. And I think that's why in the years since it has been cited as a quality of it. And one of its great strengths is the fact that it was this, rambunctious, arrogant, young, first-time filmmaker who sort of almost begrudgingly was pulled into Hollywood to make this movie. And so he said, okay, well, I'm going to break all the rules, ignore all the studio notes and what have you. He got complete negotiated total control, which was unheard of at the time. And he made this movie that was, from a formula standpoint, from a formalist standpoint, if you like, completely unlike the kind of movies that were being made at the time. And I think that continues to be the case. I mean, many people today talk about how it still feels like a very sort of modern film, even now, or even that it feels like a film that was made sort of in the future, ahead of its time, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I think a lot of those things are true, and I think that is why, as you say, you don't see it on TV all the time, or why it doesn't. A mainstream audience might not respond to it with the same sort of enduring affection
Right,
than
right.
you would with something like Casablanca, because it's just not, it doesn't hit those emotional notes in the same way.
No, it doesn't. And, in Casablanca, everybody's a good guy except the Nazis. We just get to hate the Nazis, even in the love triangle, I've always said is Paul Henreid's character, he's this, Victor Laszlo, he's the noble guy. He's not like slapping her around and you're rooting for her to run off with Rick. It's like these are three noble characters, and even Claude Rains, the French inspector, in the end he's got a heart of gold. These guys are all people you want to root for, whereas in Citizen Kane, Orson Welles' character, Charles Foster Kane, is a nuanced anti-hero type. He's not a good guy, he's not an evil guy, he's a rich industrialist, and he's got his pluses and minuses, and yeah, for 1941, I think this film came out, 41. It definitely subverted the tropes and the norms of cinema at that time.
I mean, I'm going to push back on one thing you said. I think he's an evil guy. I think he's damaged. And obviously part of the riddle and the enigma of the movie, and what is Rosebud is the idea that he was damaged from a young age when his mother essentially his parents sold him off along with the estate, essentially.
We could get into an argument of the nature of evil. I would agree with you. He's a damaged, flawed character. I would hesitate to call him evil. Like when I look in the world, I see genuine evil, and I wouldn't put Charles Foster Kane in that category.
Okay, let's say he has vindictive, manipulative qualities.
Oh, absolutely.
That often win out. And you're watching it and you're like, sure, Charles Foster Kane is based on William Randolph Hearst, who was the great sort of media mogul and was incredibly powerful at the time, and had the power and influence over almost anybody in any position of power in the US at that time, including a lot of Hollywood. And it's part of the reason why the film almost didn't get made, is he got wind of it getting made and getting written by his supposed friend Herman J. Mankiewicz, who wrote the script, and put so much pressure on RKO not to make it, and then on the cinema chains not to play it. And it might have been one of the reasons why it didn't perform so well at the Oscars as people thought it might have done. But I was watching it this time and I was like, well, not only is this murder, this is Trump. There's so much sort of Trumpiness to Kane, not least the bit when he's running for a public office. And it's looking like he's going to win, and then obviously on the night, his competitor sort of shows up and says, "I'm going to smear you, essentially, if you don't sort of concede." And it cuts to the newspaper office, and they're like, "Which headline are we going to run?" And it's like Kane wins, or the election was a fraud. And it's like, okay, well, we're going to have to go with that one, because they're the only two options that we're willing to say publicly. And I was like,
well, to me, it just shows, though, that this is issues that humankind have been wrestling with for generations. That authoritarian, manipulative, narcissistic personality type. It takes different people, but it's almost like, do you remember that movie a few years ago where John Goodman was in it, and that spirit would go through from one person to the other, and they play that classic song? I think Denzel Washington. Fallen, yes. Yeah, Denzel Washington. And I almost feel like there's this narcissistic, weird demon spirit that's going through the world, and it jumps into, and right now he's currently in Trump, and moves on to something else. I'm just joking, obviously, but I'm not joking when I mean that you're being able to identify it in a movie and then connect it to today's times, is because this is the human experience.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, I was watching, I've seen this film a few times now, and I was watching this film and knowing actually that you had just watched it and been sort of slightly less than enamored by it, shall we say?
Well, part of it's the expectations, though, going in. I mean, my whole life, this thing has topped like every movie list of the greatest movie ever made. And so I've seen some great movies in my time. So I'm expecting it to be at that level. And I mean, I enjoyed this film. It is far be it for me to say, oh, it sucked. Citizen Kane, it's trash. Who are these people thinking all this time? But safe to say, I came out of it thinking, okay, that was good, but my expectations were here, and it delivered here. And subsequently, my comments are going to be with a caveat.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, I think it was certainly a film that I watch it before? I think I probably did watch it as a teenager, and certainly didn't appreciate many of the qualities in it that have made it a great movie.
Yeah.
I appreciated the story of this kind of, like we say, flawed media mogul and what have you. But I think it was only later. I studied it at college, as everybody does. If you study film, you're going to study Citizen Kane. And what's interesting is reading about the film and how its evolution to the point of becoming, or its acceptance as quote unquote the greatest film ever made, or one of the greatest films ever made, took a long time. Actually, took at least a decade. And it like I said, it underperformed financially, and even though it got good reviews at the time, people didn't come out and see it. People didn't really like it. It wasn't the kind of movie that was being made at the time that audiences were really responding to. And then because of the subject matter, because it was this kind of sort of damning portrait of essentially Hearst, it kind of got buried, or it got sort of run out of theaters, the few theaters that would show it. And it took like a good decade or so for it to then get sort of a reprint, a reissue in the 1950s, when I think opinions and cinematic appreciation had matured, shall we say. Yeah. And people looked at it and went, they were like, Orson Welles is really doing some crazy stuff here, not least in terms of the storytelling and having the audacity to come in and take down one of the most powerful people in the country, but also from a technical point of view, because obviously back in that time, everything was being made on sound stages, and were all made in a very sort of similar fashion. Whereas if you look at what he's doing with the camera, the way he's kind of like moving the camera around, and he's doing things that seem so sort of innocuous today. Like, think of how many scenes you see the ceiling in it, and how low he has the camera all the time. And obviously part of that is an effect so that Kane always looks kind of big and powerful, and sort of too big for the room almost, the perspective. But what you're seeing is the ceilings, and in a normal film studio on a set, there's no ceiling. That's where all the lights are. And so he was having to sort of rebuild all of these sets, and apparently he was breaking holes in the ground so that he could get that, like ripping up floorboards so that he could get the camera low enough so to do this kind of thing. And then he's moving the camera around. He's doing these like rack dollies and stuff. There's a lot of very sort of aggressive pull-ins and pull-outs, for a dramatic effect. There's the famous shot near the beginning where it comes up over the sign of the building and goes down to the skylight, and then appears to kind of go through the skylight down into the restaurant where the singer is drinking herself into a stupor. And it does that more than once. And little bits like that, where just pulling things off the top of my head, I don't remember seeing that kind of stuff until Hitchcock's big studio movies in the 50s, where you would see all this kind of like sort of crazy camera work and stuff.
Well, what makes that all the more interesting, James, is Orson Welles was a radio guy. He was not a motion picture guy. He came from Mercury Theater with John Houseman, and they were so successful in the radio theater program that RKO, obviously signed him to a deal, wanted to bring him over. And it makes me wonder, as you say that, did him coming from this fresh perspective where he had to, in the radio world, create this world using only audio, that it forced him to think in different ways than maybe the traditional directors of that time would have, embraced a film or engaged a film?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, after his War of the Worlds radio show, which kind of shocked a nation into believing that they were being attacked by Martians, and to the point where people killed themselves. People actually committed suicide rather than risk being taken over by Martians because of a radio play that he did out of New York. RKO, who was the home of King Kong and what have you, but was struggling at the time, and they saw him as this hot new property. He didn't want to go, he didn't want to do it, and that's how he managed to negotiate total control of the movie, because he was like, well, I'm not going to do it, and I want to bring all my people. And I like the way that at the end of the movie it introduced it says you don't know anybody in this movie, essentially. And that's kind of staggering to think when you've got people like Joseph Cotton in the movie and big actors like that who, well, today they're big actors, but back then these are all sort of relative unknowns, certainly in the movie world. Bernard Herrmann, the composer, is another one, and he was like, oh yeah, these are all my mates from my theater troupe back in New York who I put in this movie. Allow me to introduce all of them. And he came in, he negotiated an unprecedented contract and deal, but he kind of sort of burnt it all down simultaneously, because obviously he had a career after that, but he was never able to have full control ever again. He very rarely, I mean, his next movie, The Magnificent Ambersons, was taken away from him and recut, and still to this day there is no, you can't see his version of it. I don't think it even exists. But after that, he repeatedly fell back on just adapting other people's stuff, mainly Shakespeare or Kafka or whatever it was, and funded those in order to get creative control. He had to make them outside of the studio system, funded by acting roles he would take in sort of The Third Man with Joseph Cotton or something like that. I can't remember which movie it was, but he agreed to do one movie, and in his contract, he was starring in a movie, and in his contract, he was like, I want the, I think it was Touch of Evil. Touch of Evil, where
Charlton Heston.
He's with Charlton Heston,
playing a Mexican.
Yes. And I think it was that movie. And in his contract, he was like, I want my trench coat to be lined with fur. And they're like, you're ridiculous. We're shooting in the heat, and it's going to be. And he was like, I want it to be lined with fur. And they were like, okay, fine, whatever. You can have it lined with fur. And it was because he then wanted to take the coat, turn it inside out, and use it for, like, I think it was his staging of Macbeth or Othello or one of those. He just wanted he couldn't afford the costume for his other movie. So he put it in his rider for the studio movie he was doing. It was something like that.
That's a great anecdote. That's a great anecdote. Yeah.
But it's crazy that he's known as this sort of great of cinema, and yet he had such a hard time getting anything made. And I think all of that again can be attributed or attributes to why Citizen Kane is perceived as being so good. It's because it was like the one time he had it his way, he was able to do it, and it's almost sentimental. It's like, he never, what might have been had he had those opportunities throughout his career to continue making this kind of sort of mold breaking work, but he didn't, and that was really the one time. And I think people are just sort of lauding praise on it, not just lauding praise on it for that, but I think that's one of the many qualities of it.
No, absolutely. I mean, film critics, film lovers, filmmakers, they tend to be a little bit of a rebellious lot. And the very fact that he was able to go outside the system, it's kind of like, he did what I think a lot of filmmakers, they envy and they aim for, is having that complete creative control, but with the full studio budget backing to be able to create the vision he wanted. Yeah, I saw Orson Welles in a interview from the 70s. I think it was like the Dick Cavett show, or one of those early interviewers on TV. And it just impressed on me again, even from watching Citizen Kane. And he was in an interview with John Houseman as well. They were reminiscing about Citizen Kane in their old days at the Mercury Theater, it was a fascinating interview. I'll try to get a link to it if I can and put it in the show notes. But while he's sitting there, James, he is just a massive man. And granted, in later life, he put on a bit of weight. But there's a difference between weight and just this massive frame. Like, this is just a presence. He's a force of nature. And that's one of the things that comes across in Citizen Kane is Orson Welles is not just creatively a force of nature. He is physically a force of nature.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, and he did something in that movie or the entire cast did, which was not unheard of, but it was not necessarily the usual thing. I mean, he was 25 when he made that movie. And I don't think the character is ever 25. It's either played by a child actor, or he's basically older and older and older and older and older. And I think the norm would have been to cast somebody in their kind of 40s or mid 40s or something, and age him down and age him up. But he was like, no, I'm 25 and I'm going to play a guy in his 60s.
All the way through. Yeah.
Right. And then the whole cast get the opportunity to do that, because obviously the whole film is being told in flashback through interviews with the survivors of the story, all of whom are pretty young and all of whom are, wearing a lot of makeup. And that is obviously a very theatrical conceit.
Yeah.
That's something that he brings from the Mercury Theatre tool. And again, sort of defies the norms of filmmaking. But you don't really ever kind of, I mean, you kind of notice, but you can tell, but you never really kind of hold it against him, because his, like you say, his presence, his screen presence is so commanding, that you just kind of go with it and let him have it.
Yeah. I will say, though, as far as, and I know it's a very popular script, and there's, obviously Manx co-wrote it with Orson Welles. But I found, if I'm really honest, I found it, going into segues with this, the wife that he has the affair with, or the woman he has an affair with becomes his wife, and the opera situation and forcing her into it. I mean, I understand why you put that in, to show this kind of narcissistic character that this guy is, but I found it a little bit uninteresting. I thought I would have taken this character in other avenues and rode that character car in different encounters and situations. I thought, the whole thing, forcing your wife to be the opera star, she's not that talented, she doesn't really want to do it, but I'm going to force her to do it anyhow. I thought, I didn't see that it wasn't bad by any stretch, but I didn't see any like, wow, that screenplay was just fantastic. I didn't come away with that feeling.
And ironically, that's the Oscar it won.
Exactly. Which, shows you where I'm at. Shows you where I'm at. But no, I'm just giving my perspective.
No, of course. It's interesting, because that's definitely one of the elements that is a very specific dig at Hearst, because Hearst was having an affair with I think I'm getting this right, with Marion Davis, the actress, and he definitely sort of forced her career upon studios and what have you, and he helped engineer and navigate and build buzz for her and all the rest of it in the way that Kane does. So it's one of the many sort of examples in the script where it's really sticking it to Hearst, and you've got to think a lot of that is coming from Mankiewicz, and if you watch David Fincher's film Mank, a lot of it is covered in there, but it's kind of really personal, and at the same time you're taking on sort of the biggest guy in town, the most powerful guy in town, so it's very sort of daring, it's very sort of perhaps ill-advised to have done it. Of course, the other thing is Rosebud, and apparently that's sort of a joke as well, because to put this delicately, apparently Rosebud was the nickname that Hearst gave to his wife or his lover's lady garden, shall we say?
Okay.
apparently now maybe that's the version
urban legend, possibly, who knows.
That's the version of the story that I have heard and know, and who knows, it's been almost 100 years, and some of this stuff has almost certainly sort of been amped up and debunked and what have you. But that's the version of the story I remember, and I think that's hilarious that this whole movie is about what is Rosebud, and if you're Hearst, you know exactly what it is, and you're incredibly embarrassed about it.
Yeah. Well, it's just another reason too why probably this movie finds itself at the top of a lot of lists, because we all love a story that digs after the rich and the powerful, and although I'm not familiar, being even at my age of 56, with William Randolph Hearst that well, I'm sure people in the 50s and 60s, when Citizen Kane was finding its new audience, they were still very much aware of this guy. And I mean, I'm just trying to think the way I feel about Donald Trump. If somebody came up with a really great allegorical, semi-biographical, where they really took Trump to task, but did it in such a creative way, I would be going, that's the top of one of my lists,
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think it is just the culmination of all of those things, really.
Yeah.
You know, it's a takedown of a very powerful and unpopular person. It's you know, a mold breaking piece of cinema that is, on the one hand, I suppose, actually quite funny. It's kind of a comedy on the one hand, but then it adopts many of those aesthetics of sort of German expressionism and film noir almost. You know, it's a lot of sort of dark long shadows and light beams of light coming from, you know, seemingly impossible angles. You know, he lives in a haunted castle, essentially. You know, he's like Dracula or something. You know, he lives up there on his own. But
called Xanadu.
yeah, exactly. And then he also, but it's also very funny, I think. You know, it's a satire more than anything. And so it's mixing all of these different sort of tropes of filmmaking and storytelling that are, again, are ill-advised. You know, one would say, you know, these don't go together. You can't make this kind of movie. You can't make this script in this style. And he's like, well, I can, and I'm going to, because I don't care. Yeah, he's literally like, I don't care. I didn't want to be here anyway, but I was given enough of an opportunity to do it. And because the one thing I wanted to say, in addition to, you know, the way that he frames Kane in all of those sort of early sequences, particularly in the newspaper offices and what have you, where there's that song and dance routine which has been ripped off by The Simpsons many years later.
Oh, right.
I know a man named Mr. Burns. Blah, blah, blah. In fact, there are so many Citizen Kane references in The Simpsons that it would take a whole episode to go through them all. But if you compare how he's framed in the sort of newspaper offices with how he's framed in his huge estate towards the end, you see sort of the shrinking of this sort of great titan. You know, in those early sequences, he can barely fit in the room almost by the way that he's being framed. But by the end, it's this vast, cavernous, expansive space where he's just another ornament, another trinket in this accumulated sort of worthless wealth, you know. And you know, there are subtleties like that, or just sort of intuitive pieces of filmmaking that you're like, oh, he totally understood exactly what he was doing. Just because nobody else was doing it at the time doesn't make this any less of a sort of signature piece of work at it.
Well, James, you know, the reason I know that Orson Welles was in his 20s is because it's referred to a number of times in Ed Wood, the Tim Burton movie with Johnny Depp, where he goes when he's really depressed, and he's the worst filmmaker in the world, and the humor and the irony of him going to see is arguably one of the greatest filmmakers ever. They meet in the bar, and you know, obviously Johnny Depp's playing a very eccentric Ed Wood, and he's always kind of just bemoaning the fact that Orson Welles was doing his own, you know, had made it big by the time he was 29, and here he is, you know, he's in his 30s now, and he has that great encounter with Vincent D'Onofrio playing Orson Welles, and he just gives him the inspiration he needs to go and make what is arguably the cult classic worst film ever made in the world. But I love that scene. I always find it really humorous.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, I love Ed Wood. I think it's probably still Tim Burton's best movie. And one of the great things about it is that Ed Wood sees himself as Orson Welles, sees himself as this talent, as, you know, who just needs to find his break. And I think that too is one of the great attractions of the story is, but for every new generation of filmmaker, you look at Orson Welles and that he was in his 20s and he came to Hollywood and he made, he broke all the rules, made it his way, and made, a film that is revered as one of the greatest of all time. And I think generation after generation look at that movie and go, that's what I want to do. I want to do that. I want to make it that way.
Yeah.
I think recent years, you have to look at someone, and people will push back against this, like sort of Tarantino, who kind of came from outside of the system and tore it apart and then rebuilt it the way that he wanted to. And it's easy to forget sort of the huge influence that Reservoir Dogs, but especially Pulp Fiction straight after it, had on American cinema in the 90s.
Absolutely.
There really was like a line in the sand, and you could say before Pulp Fiction and after Pulp Fiction. And I think it was it was the same in Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane just showed what, and this is not me saying that Pulp Fiction is the new Citizen Kane or anything like that,
No.
but it's just a young sort of maverick filmmaker coming from outside the system, without sort of the formal training, without working his way up, and just, you know, completely upending the form, really, the artistic form.
No, I mean, if there is a heir apparent to that, Orson Welles, obviously a number of names could be thrown out, but
Sure.
Tarantino would definitely be one of them.
And I only cite Tarantino because that's sort of my generation's Orson Welles, if you like, you know.
Right.
Reservoir Dogs came out when I was like 15, and it was just like, okay, yeah, great. Yeah. So, but yes, there have been many others as well, but but that's the one that sort of strikes me. And we
can ask people at the end, who would you say would be who's your Orson Welles? Who do you see as an Orson Welles filmmaker?
Yeah, who's doing that today?
Yeah,
you know? I mean, because that was a great time for American cinema. Steven Soderbergh is another one who was doing things. Even someone, and this is really going to have people turn their nose up. Even someone like Kevin Smith, you know, who basically was completely. He made his first movie in the convenience store where he worked.
Yeah.
With his credit cards, essentially. Yeah. Maxed out all his credit cards and made it at night with his friends. And he now has an incredibly successful career. You know, that's just how it happened. But yes, no, there have been many mavericks over the years, not least obviously the French New Wave in the 50s, where a bunch of critics essentially went, they were sick of cinema, and they were like, we can do this better. And actually they were responsible for recognizing these sort of past masters of Hollywood in a way that they weren't being recognized in Hollywood at that time, or being or legitimizing them as master artists.
Spielberg's gotten so big that we hesitate to put him in that same category. But if you think about him in the early 70s, when he was doing Duel and doing Jaws, I mean, Jaws, nobody was thinking that was going to reinvent the summer blockbuster. And everything
there was no such thing as a summer blockbuster.
As a summer blockbuster. That became the summer blockbuster after that, is what he created the summer blockbuster. And, you know, it was not a given that he was going to be a successful director at that time. He was really flying by his bootstraps. And now we look back and think, it's a given. But as we saw in The Fabelmans, it was not a foregone conclusion. He was definitely a maverick and an innovator in his early days.
Absolutely. I mean, and the other thing I want to say is it's fascinating revisiting this movie, having sort of just watched and talked about Tar. You know, where one of the great sort of conversations in Tar is about sort of these past masters, you know, old cis white men, you know, who built the industry essentially, and whether or not they should continue to be revered as such many years later, or whether that they should be swept aside in favor of sort of a new generation of diverse and inclusive voices. And particularly coming to it sort of almost to pass judgment again, you know, almost to say, well, you know, here you are, you're the granddaddy of sort of classic Hollywood cinema. Do you still deserve your place in the pantheon of great films? And so it was just fascinating having the voice of Lydia Tarr and having the voice of current film critical thinking, if you like, in my swirling around my head as I'm watching a film that is coming up on 80, it's just gone 80 years 80 years old, and giving it trying to look at it with fresh eyes again.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for our 100th video special where we highlight Citizen Kane. One of the reasons we chose Citizen Kane, among it being one of the greatest films of all time, is because we're right at the period in our Every Best Picture series where it lost to How Green Is My Valley. Where it lost to How Green Was My Valley. And obviously very controversial, looking back at all these years, what should have won that year. And obviously Citizen Kane did not. What do you think about that?
You can't even remember the name of the film that beat it. You know?
So granted, it's a little bit longer and a little more tongue twisty than Citizen Kane, but your point is well taken.
There you go. So yes, I mean, have you seen Citizen Kane? Is it one of those films that you feel is still important or is not important? All views and opinions are available. Let's get that discourse going. Does it still deserve its place as one of the greatest films of all time? We have seen actually in recent years that in some polls it has lost out on its number one pole position standing. But where do you feel? Is it still an important film? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? And as we asked earlier on, who is this generation's Orson Welles? Who do you see as shaking it up, breaking the mold, and pushing forward in ways that are upsetting the system, but are probably building for future generations?
Well, we're going to end up just rambling on. So until next episode, thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures. Oh, what a hit you would be.